welcome to or back to our channel. If we are producing any kind of content you like, we would ask that you would give us a thumbs up. If possible, subscribe to our channel. You're more than welcome to leave comments below. We welcome some critique. Just keep them civil. With that said, today we're going to look at the 5th chapter of Ecclesiastes, and we'll try to break it down in about 2 or 3 sections, but I think we'll cover the entire chapter today. So let's get started. Ecclesiastes 5, verses 1 through, we'll read down through verse 7. Keep thy foot when thou goest to the house of God, and be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they consider not that they do evil. Be not rash with thy mouth, let not thy heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and thou upon the earth. Therefore let thy words be few. For a dream come through a multitude of business, and a fool's voice is known by multitude of words. When you vow a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay that which you have vowed. Better is it that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. Verse 6, suffer not thy mouth to cause the flesh to sin, neither say thou before the angel that it was an error. Wherefore should God be angry at thy voice and destroy the work of thy hands? For in a multitude of dreams and many words there are also divers vanities, but fear thou God. So in verse 1, he tells us to guard our steps when we go into the house of God. In King James, it says, keep thy foot, but a newer translation says, guard your steps when you go to the house of God. You need to watch what you do when you go into the house of God. Why? Well, at this time, he was talking about the temple of God, or a synagogue, or the tabernacle. But our house of God is our church houses. And this is telling us we need to watch our steps when we go into church houses. It should be a reverent place. The longer we go, the less reverent we become in the house of God. I know in our church, we're very traditional, so we're still fairly reverent in today's manner of speaking in our sanctuaries. But maybe over in a fellowship hall or in the Sunday school classrooms, we're a lot more laxed and less reverent. But we should be sure that we are being reverent and that we understand that we are coming, in theory, into the presence of God. And I realize he dwells in us and he dwells in all creation. I realize that he's omnipresent. But this is a place set aside for the worship of God. He says, my house shall be called the house of prayer. So it says to guard your steps when you go in the house of God. And one of the ways he wants you to do that is to be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools. For they consider not that they do evil. So the person that's giving the sacrifice of fools don't understand that there's being evil. So what is the sacrifice of fools? Well, that is pretty difficult to define, but I actually think that the longer I researched it, that the next 3 or 4 verses explain it better than it is anywhere else in the scriptures. Because what he starts talking about is to be right off the bat in verse 1, be more ready to hear, right, than to give sacrifice of fools. So in other words, be more ready to listen to what God is saying than to tell God. So many of our prayers are more talking than listening. It's more like, and I realize you hear people preach and teach, and it's not, this is not necessarily a wrong teaching, but that to repeat prayers back, to repeat God's promises back to him, claim those promises, that's not wrong. Well, I agree with that to a point. But at some point, we don't want to take that to the point that we're telling God what he's required to do because of what it says in his word. We need to understand the positions that God is holy and in heaven, and that we are earthly and on earth. So verse 1, guard your steps when you go in the house of God. Be more ready to hear than to offer the sacrifice of fools. And let's see what that is. Verse 2 says, be not rash with your mouth. So he just got through saying, don't be out offering the sacrifice of fools. Don't be rash with your mouth. Let not your heart be hasty to utter or to speak anything before God. For God is in heaven and you're on the earth. So he's saying, when we go in to worship God, it's not always about us doing all the talking. We need to learn somehow to listen. And that can be done when you're listening to a pastor preach, or when you're listening to a teacher teach, or when you're listening to God as you're singing a hymn, but you're listening for the still small voice of God. Verse 3 says, for a dream cometh through a multitude of business. So when a person's really busy and got all kinds of things going on, a lot of times he'll dream about that at night when he's got a whole host of things he's trying to take care of. And he doing a comparison there, he says, and a fool's voice is known by the multitude of words. So just like being real busy and having lots of things to do will cause you to dream about those things you're doing sometimes, a fool's voice is known. You know it's a fool speaking because he never shuts his mouth. And he's speaking to God. He says in verse 4, when you vow a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. So vowing a vow before God. God, if you'll only do this for me, I will never do that again. Or God, if you will do this or that, then I will do this or this. He says, if you say that, then you better do it. Verse 5 says, better is it that you should not vow the vow than that you should vow the vow, not pay it. Over in Matthew, Jesus speaking, he says, but what think you? This is Matthew 21, 28 through 32. Jesus speaking says, but what think you? A certain man had 2 sons. He came to the first and said, son, go work today in my vineyard. And he answered and said, I will not. And afterward, he repented and went. And in verse 30, he says, and he came to his second son and said, likewise, go work in my vineyard. And he answered and said, I go, sir, but went not. And he asked the question, whether of them 2 did the will of his father. And they said to him, the first one. The first one that said, I won't do that, but then did what the father had asked. It's far better than saying, I will do something and then not doing it. So don't fall into the foolish trap of bargaining with God. You're but flesh and you're weak. Then in verse 6, it says, suffer not your mouth to cause the flesh to sin. So you run your mouth, and then you say you're going to do this and you'll do that, but then you don't follow through with it. I have seen, I've even seen paid church staff that agreed to do certain things, and they'll start well, but they can't follow through. They don't have any follow through, no stick to itness. To tell God you're going to do something, then not to do it, is that not a sin? Suffer not thy mouth, verse 6, to cause thy flesh to sin, neither say thou before an angel that it was an error. Don't say, well, that was a mistake. I didn't mean to say. I shouldn't have said that. So neither say thou before an angel that it was an error. Wherefore should God be angry at thy voice and destroy the work of your hands? Verse 7, for in the multitude of dreams and many words there are also diverse vanities. In many words, there are diverse vanities. In many words, there is usually lots of empty, meaningless sayings. We need to approach God in fear and humility. Verses 8 to 9, two of the most difficult verses maybe in the Bible to get your arms around. I checked several different references and scholars, and two main thoughts that are almost totally opposite are represented, but we'll read them and see what we think. Verse 8, if thou see the oppression of the poor, and the violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province, marvel not at the matter. For he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. Moreover, the profit of the earth is for all. The king himself is served by the field. So the first thing, and the to me the biggest truth we pull from this is in the first sentence. If you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province, marvel not at that. Don't let that amaze you. That's been seen throughout all eternity. So why would it, throughout all time, we've seen those things. We have it today. They had it, apparently, when Solomon was writing this. We see that sort of thing in communist countries where the poor are oppressed and beat down by dictatorships. And you see it some even in a capitalist society. But then it goes into this in verse the second part of verse 8. He says, for he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. Moreover, the profit of the earth is for all. The king himself is served by the field. So some commentators or biblical experts think this is saying that don't marvel at the fact that there's oppression in the world and injustice, because there's a government there to take care of that. And if the government doesn't take care of it, there's another layer of authority or government over them that will see to it. And if they don't take care of it, there's yet another layer of government that will take care of it. And I guess if you follow that to its nth degree, in the end, the ultimate authority would be God. So that's how a lot of commentators see this and explain it. Others say just the opposite, that the reason these people are oppressed is because there's a higher authority over them that's oppressing them, and that authority is oppressing because they are being oppressed by one above them, who is being oppressed by one that's above them. And I've almost concluded in my own mind, one of those opinions I talk about is that either way would be true. We have oppression in the world. People who are, where there's injustice, things are done wrong. And like I spoke a minute ago, I see that coming at this from an American's point of view in communist countries where this has been very, very true. The extreme poverty in a lot of the communist countries, just you can see it just in the difference in North and South Korea. You can see it, the extreme, well, appears to be wealth for most Americans as compared to most of the people in other countries, in more communist nations, where they've been oppressed by their government. But at the same time, I can see the Bible teaches that the government's put there by God so that we can have a peaceful existence in our nations, and it's put there for a good purpose. Now, just because it's put there for a good purpose doesn't necessarily mean it always does what's right. But this one thing that you can be assured of, you should not be surprised when you see that in this old sinful world that we live in. In America, however, the government is by the people, for the people, right? And we do have a mechanism by which we can change the leaderships in our government, from the local government to the state governments to the federal government. We have a mechanism to change those if they are overly oppressive. Sometimes their bureaucracies become oppressive, and sometimes the rich become oppressive. But most people, given the opportunity, will oppress someone else. So do not be surprised when you see this in this old world. And it goes on and starts back with a more familiar theme throughout the rest of this chapter that we've discussed this theme in previous chapters, but we'll run through it real quick. Verse 10. He that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver, nor he that loveth abundance with increase. This is also vanity. When goods increase, they are increased that eat them. And what good is there to the owners thereof, saving the beholding of them with their eyes? Verse 12, the sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats a little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. Verse 13, there is a sore evil which I have seen under the sun, namely, riches kept for the owners thereof to their hurt. Verse 14, for those riches perish by evil travail, and he begetteth a son, and there is nothing in his hand. As he came forth of his mother's womb, naked shall he return, to go as he came, and he shall take nothing of his labor which he may carry away in his hand. Verse 16, this also is a sore evil, that in all points as he came, he shall go. And what profit has he that has labored for the wind? Verse 17, all his days also eateth in darkness, and he has much sorrow and wrath in his sickness. Behold, that which I have seen, it is good and comely for me, for one to eat and to drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor, that he taketh under the sun all the days of his life which God gives him, for it is his portion. Every man also to whom God has given riches and wealth, and hath given him power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, and to rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. For he shall not much remember the days of his life, because God answereth him in the joy of his heart. So, like I say, these last several verses, actually, I guess last 10 verses of chapter 5 is almost a refrain of some of what he said before. And I'll just scan real quickly through them. He says, verse 10, he that loves silver won't be satisfied with silver. If you get silver and gold and riches, you will just want more and more. I think of, remember Donald Duck's Uncle Scrooge. I guess that's Scrooge McDuck, that had all the riches, and he had a big safe, and he would have, and he would sit in there and just rub his money and throw it up in the air and rejoicing. So he says, he loves his abundance and grace, and he gives, in verse 11, when his goods increase, they are increased that eat them. And what good is there to the owners thereof, saving the beholding? There's only good that gave him was that he got to sit and look at what he had. He goes on in verse 12 that says, the sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats a little or a lot. So a man that labors and works for what he has, his sleep is sweet, mainly because he's so tired. But whether he has a little, whether he's earned a little bit or whether he's earned a great deal, his sleep, because he worked for it, his sleep is sweet. But a rich man, a lot of times can't sleep for fear of losing what he has. And he goes on, he says, verse 15, quoted somewhat, paraphrased a great deal. a man takes nothing out of this world. He came into it naked. He's going to leave it naked. The wisest man never lived saw that same phenomenon, that we come into the world with nothing, and we're sure that we're not going to take anything. And he goes on to summarize that the best thing you can do in this old world, if you're going to live it like there's no God, is to enjoy the fruits of your labor, the gifts that God have given you, and eat, drink, and enjoy, because that's the best you'll ever be in this world outside of God. We need to understand that everything in this world without God is vanity. That's what he's trying to teach us throughout this whole book, is that if your happiness is based on worldly possessions and worldly things, you will never find satisfaction. The only satisfaction you'll ever find is in the Son.